So you're thinking about buying the Lian Li Q58 and are wondering how the thermals are. Or maybe you've just bought one and you're wondering what the best panel orientation for the side panels is. Or maybe you're wondering if the mesh side panel kit is worth it, thermally speaking, for your existing rig. Well, so am I. I bought the mesh panel kit. I've done the tests, the results are in, and before we read them, we gotta set a baseline. My specs are as follows. I have an EVGA for the Win 3 Ultra RTX 3080 12 gig, an Asus ROG Strix LC 11 or LC2, something like that, 240mm AIO, cooling, an i7 12700K, 32 gigs of DDR5 5600, and a Asus ROG Strix B660i gaming Wi-Fi motherboard, all being powered by a 750 watt Cooler Master Gold SFX power supply. I'm using the SFX power supply in the SFX L orientation in this case so that I can have a bottom intake fan for the best possible cooling in the case. My testing methodology is as follows. I'll be running the Port Royal stress test twice, back to back, on every fan orientation, and then immediately after the Port Royal stress test, I'm running the Port Royal benchmark. Just immediately after, then giving the system 30 minutes to cool down and starting the next round of tests for the next panel orientation. We'll test the system with all of its panels off as a baseline and go from there. And I mean every panel off, including the front. A couple of things to note before we start. All of the tests will be run with the AIO and fan speeds all set to their maximum possible value, so test results will likely be amplified in real-world scenarios. The fans on the AIO have been replaced with Noctua NF F12s, and not the stock fans that come with the cooler. The Port Royal stress test and benchmark also only use 1 or 2 cores. When you're playing a modern game, you're using more than 2 cores. If you're playing the new Call of Duty, you're using 4 or 6 processing cores, which will make your CPU much hotter, making these results amplify themselves in real-world scenarios. Let's roll the benchmarks. Those results are something to look at. Obvious results are, well, obvious. And from worst to best, let's talk about the results. Covering the GPU side is obviously not a good idea to suffocate your GPU with tempered glass. Not to mention, I have a 3-slot behemoth of a card that is directly next to the glass. There is no way for it to breathe there. The frame rate stability score failed here because the card thermal throttled multiple times during the test and was pinned at 100% the entire duration of the test. The card thermal throttles at 86, that's why we averaged 86 degrees. I do not recommend this orientation unless you have a custom water loop in the case and want to stare at only the GPU. In that scenario, it's passable, but still not recommended. Putting the glass on the bottom of the case runs into the same issue as putting the glass on only the GPU side of the case, only with, slightly more airflow for the GPU. You're suffocating the GPU, and this time you're suffocating the power supply as well. If the power supply didn't have a bottom intake fan or the top quarter of the power supply fan poking up over the tempered glass, it would be a fairly bad situation for computer reliability. I cannot recommend this orientation to anybody. Having the glass on only the motherboard side of the case did just fine for thermals for the CPU and the GPU. Neither were the highest I'd seen. However, I cannot recommend suffocating your power supply like this. If we didn't have a bottom intake fan, I think the system wouldn't have gone through the test. Power supplies tend to not have the ability to adjust the fan curve and require much lower operating temperatures than the rest of your system. They typically throttle it a little over 50 degrees Celsius. And when a power supply detects that it gets too hot, the entire system shuts down and will not start back up until the power supply decides it's cool enough to start back up again. I cannot recommend this orientation either, unless you're willing to risk a little bit of system instability for some aesthetics. Putting the glass on top of the system so that it covers the top half of both chambers seems to be fine for gaming workloads. You're feeding the AIO with hot air from the power supply and GPU, however, it should be able to handle it with the right hardware. You'll have higher CPU temps, obvious statement is obvious, but with a focus on gaming, the GPU should be under most of the load while you're playing games. I did notice this was the original orientation I had my system in, and when I was playing Call of Duty for long periods of time, my CPU would get up over 80 degrees Celsius. It wouldn't thermal throttle, but it would get a little too hot for my comfort. You should be fine with this orientation if you're okay with a little bit hotter temps. The mesh side panel kit gives you 2 extra mesh panels to have all 4 quadrants of the case covered in mesh. This is the best possible orientation while still having side panels, by far. While it might be the least aesthetic orientation, it's the best for airflow because, well, everything is mesh and it has the least amount of resistance while still being a case and not an open air test bench. I was able to find the mesh panels on Newegg for $15 a while ago, but it doesn't seem to be in stock anymore. I had to order my black panels from South Korea on eBay. I think it was well worth the $50 because not only are my thermals better in games, I'm able to set actual fan curves down from yes to maybe so and make it significantly quieter and cooler at the same time. The best computer case has always been the box it came in, so it isn't surprising that the best orientation is to just not have side panels. I wouldn't really recommend doing this. You bought a case for a reason. Just spend the extra few dollars on the side panels instead of just taking everything off. It's a computer case. You paid for it. You paid for the whole computer case. Use the whole computer case. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Maybe found it helpful. If you did, don't forget to rate, comment, and subscribe. See you guys in the next one.